I join you all?
Sure.
Thank you. Feels chilly in here.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Try to manage.
Pardon me?
Visit me talk as to how to do it.
There you go. Surprised there aren't more people. It's right at 6.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm surprised there's not a bunch of people.
People are packed.
Yeah, that's true. This is a very different place than it was last night, though. With John Edwards here, it was packed
Oh,
and people
really?
were in overflow rooms, and yeah. So that's John Edwards was here last night. He was the Democratic nominee for vice president. He spoke here last night. I've never seen this place so packed.
Was he good?
His Q&A, I thought, gave you more of a glimpse of him as a person, and his comments sounded more like a camp speech.
Yeah.
So, and I like to get at more of who the people are and really hear them. So I enjoyed the Q&A more. So yeah, that was sort of the speculation among some of the folks I talked with afterwards, was how much of this is still running, preparing.
Yeah. Interesting. He wasn't letting down his guard. He's gonna let anything slip out that shouldn't be slipping out.
Well, it's funny because one of the questions, in fact, I think it was the first question, was asking him to sort of critique the Democrats' campaign and talk about what he would do differently in retrospect. And his answer was, I'd rather talk about the future and not critique the past. And here's what I think lies ahead. And so even with
Very
that,
much.
yeah.
That's hilarious.
So,
Oh, interesting.
yeah.
Just give me 1 minute.
Good evening. I'm John Holdren. I'm the Heinz Professor of Environmental Policy at the Kennedy School. I direct the program on science, technology, and public policy in the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. I was one of the co-chairs of the National Commission on Energy Policy that we're going to talk about this evening. I thank you all for coming. I'm going to start by introducing my fellow panelists. Then I'll give a brief introduction to the background and findings of the National Commission. Then I'll direct a couple of rounds of questions to the panelists, and then we'll throw it open to discussion with the audience in a Q&A format. On my immediate left is Phil Sharp. He's the acting director of the Institute of Politics, a former regular director of the Institute of Politics. He was the congressional chair of the National Commission on Energy Policy. He served for 20 years in the House of Representatives, 1975 to 1995, extremely centrally involved in the formation of the nation's energy policy in those years. He served the whole time on the House Energy and Commerce Committee, chaired the Energy and Power Subcommittee of the House Energy and Commerce Committee from 97 until he retired from Congress in 1995. He is a senior policy advisor at Van Ness Feldman and a senior research fellow with the Environment and Natural Resources Program at the Kennedy School Belfer Center. So he has a number of roles here. To his left is Sue Tierney. She is managing principal in the analysis group, former Assistant Secretary of Energy for Policy. She had amazingly wide-ranging responsibilities at DOE, strategic planning for policy analysis, development and advice on domestic and international energy policy, environmental policy, international trade policy, science and technology policy, and global climate change policy. She has also served as the Secretary of Environmental Affairs for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, as a commissioner for the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities, and many other things, but I won't take our time to read too many of them, except to mention that she is also the chairman of the board of the Energy Foundation, a major NGO in the renewable energy and energy efficiency area. And to her left is William Rosenberg. He was a consultant to the Commission. He's a visiting senior fellow in the Center for Business and Government and in the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs in the Kennedy School. He's had a checkered career, 14 years as a corporate lawyer and energy and environmental consultant, 11 years as a real estate developer and venture capitalist, and 13 years of public service under 2 presidents and 2 governors, in which capacities he led 3 energy, utility, and environmental regulatory programs. He was the head of the Environmental Protection Agency's Clean Air Program under the senior President Bush starting in 1988, after the '88 election, centrally involved in the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, responsible for making market-based programs work within the EPA's regulatory framework, including the acid rain allowance trading system, the chlorofluorocarbon phase-out, reformulated gasoline, Tier 1 cleaner cars, and has been responsible for saving the taxpayers a great deal of money in connection with the success of those programs. Much involved these days with us in the Belfer Center in our programs on clean coal technology, and he was involved with the Commission on clean coal and natural gas issues. Let me, with those introductions, get into the presentation and start with the basic background of the Commission. I'm going to run through this sort of quickly so as not to take up too much of the interaction time, but we will post this on the Belfer Center website so that if anything goes by too quickly that you want to look back at, you can find it there by tomorrow morning. The Commission was launched 3 years ago. It met a dozen times. It sponsored and digested more than 35 commissioned background and research papers by a wide variety of institutions across the country, issued interim reports on natural gas and electricity restructuring. Its final report was issued in Washington, released in Washington on December 8th. It cost $10 million. It was not a commission formed by or requested by the government. It was set up on the private initiative of the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. That foundation was joined in supporting it by the MacArthur Foundation, the Packard Foundation, the Pew Charitable Trust, and the Energy Foundation. The commission was constructed from the very beginning to be very carefully bipartisan. The leadership, 3 co-chairs and a congressional chair, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, a electric utility chairman, Bill Riley, who had been the head of the Environmental Protection Agency under the senior President Bush, myself, and Phil Sharp. The other members of the commission, similarly diverse. One sees there represented the consumer movement, the environmental movement, CEO of a major oil company, the vice president of the Ford Motor Company, a Nobel laureate in atmospheric chemistry, a state government, state senator from Texas, the president of the United Steelworkers, so labor is there, a former director of the CIA, Linda Stuntz, who was Deputy Secretary of Energy in the Reagan administration. Very, very broad and, again, carefully constructed group from the standpoint of bipartisanship and diverse sectoral and political perspectives. Let me, in turning to the substance, start with the reason that we talk about an energy stalemate, even in the title of the report. This was supposed to be a sequential slide. I apologize for its busyness. I forgot to push the right button when I was making the PowerPoint. But there are a lot of respects in which the U.S. energy policy situation can be considered a stalemate. There's been a gap between rising oil demand and declining domestic production, widening since 1985. Little policy action to address that, either on the supply side or the demand side. The corporate average fuel economy standards, the CAFE standards, have been unchanged since 1985 for passenger cars. That's in quotes because we have another category, light-duty trucks, pickups, vans, and sport utility vehicles that are also mainly used as passenger vehicles. That finally went up after being constant since 1987. This year, a little bit. The whole fleet, new car, fuel economy average for the United States fleet, divided as it is between these categories, was the same in 2003 as it had been in 1981, 24 miles a gallon. 13 years after the United States ratified the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, 1992, which I'm afraid many members of the Congress have forgotten that we ratified, but never mind, 13 years later, there is no requirement or incentive in place to reduce carbon dioxide emissions from the energy sector. No new nuclear reactor ordered in the United States since 1978. As we know around here, the siting of LNG terminals and even wind farms is increasingly stymied by the famous not in my backyard syndrome. Nobody wants anything located near them. 2003 federal spending on energy, technology, research, development, and demonstration is about the same as it was in 1987. The Commission's overarching objective was to develop recommendations that could ensure ample, clean, reliable, affordable energy for the United States in the 21st century, while at the same time addressing concerns about energy security and about the risks of global climate change. It was designed to try to command the bipartisan support that would be needed to break the stalemate and actually be enacted. I'll give you a quick survey of some of the key recommendations. Can't, in the time available, talk about all of them, but I'll hit what I consider to be some of the highlights. First, with respect to dampening the growth of demand for liquid fuels, we recommended significantly strengthening the federal fuel economy standards for cars and light trucks, while also reforming the CAFE program, making it more flexible in a variety of ways. We explored a range of possible increases, ranging from 10 to 20 miles a gallon over the 24 level of the present by 2015. In that connection, called for manufacturer and consumer incentives to promote domestic production and to increase the use of highly efficient advanced diesel and hybrid electric vehicles. That means domestic production of those vehicles as opposed to buying them all from Japan and elsewhere, and also recommended pursuing efficiency opportunities in the heavy-duty truck fleet and in the existing passenger vehicle fleet as opposed to new vehicles. Under the heading of facing up to climate change with mandatory greenhouse gas constraints, we recommended initiating in 2010 a mandatory economy-wide tradable permit system to limit greenhouse gas emissions. The number of permits would be based on reducing the greenhouse gas intensity of the economy, that is, tons of carbon equivalent emissions per $1 million of real GDP, to reduce that ratio at 2.4% per year. We agreed to have what we call a safety valve to cap the initial cost of the US economy at $7 per metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. That means about $26 per ton of contained carbon. And what that means is in the tradable permit market, when the price, if the price reaches the safety valve level, at that point the government becomes willing to sell as many additional permits as are demanded. That means it effectively turns into a carbon tax at that point. And that gives a sense of a degree of predictability about the most that this measure can cost. We also called for linking subsequent US action beyond the initiation of this approach with comparable efforts by other developed and developing countries by means of reviewing the program in 2015 and every 5 years thereafter to see if other countries are coming along, and if they're not, to revisit what the United States should be doing. Made a series of recommendations about accelerating energy technology innovation, starting with revising the tax code to increase the incentives to the private sector to invest in energy research, development, demonstration, and early deployment of advanced technologies. We called for roughly doubling the annual federal expenditures for energy research, development, and demonstration over the next 5 years. That means it would reach from about $1.7 billion a year in 2004, it would go to $3.3 billion in the same year, 2004 dollars, by 2010. Within that effort, we called for tripling the federal investment in international cooperation on energy technology innovation, because you have to get these improvements to happen everywhere if you want to affect the climate problem, the oil issue, the nuclear issue, whatever. And we called for complementing the increased activity in research and development and demonstration with the tripling of federal expenditures supporting accelerated deployment of the most promising technologies that successfully get past the demonstration phase. That means those federal expenditures would reach $2 billion a year in 2010. We had a number of specific focuses in the energy technology innovation recommendations. One was cleaner coal technology, sometimes called clean coal technology, but I like the term cleaner because there's no such thing as absolutely clean, either with coal or anything else. We recommended speeding up the commercialization of integrated gasification combined cycle multi-purpose coal plants. That means they can make electricity, gaseous fuels, liquid fuels, with $400 million a year in federal early deployment incentives over the next decade, $4 billion altogether. Those plants have a lot of advantages compared to ordinary coal plants. They can reduce conventional air pollutants, produce multiple outputs, and they are much more easily and economically retrofitted to capture carbon dioxide than conventional coal power plants are. In parallel with that, we called for accelerating the development and commercial scale demonstration of the technologies to realize that potential to capture carbon dioxide and sequester it away from the atmosphere to the tune of $300 million a year in federal support over the decade. In the nuclear energy area, we called for providing $2 billion over 10 years from the federal research, development, demonstration, and early deployment budgets for one or two first-mover advanced nuclear power plants to try to demonstrate the improved safety and economics that have been advertised for such plants. We call for moving expeditiously to establish a project for centralized interim engineered storage of the spent fuel at no fewer than 2 US locations, ending the singularization of Nevada, which is causing a lot of the paralysis in nuclear waste management today. And we called for working in parallel to reduce the links between nuclear energy and the proliferation of nuclear weapons in a number of ways, reiterating the commitment of the United States to continue indefinitely our longstanding moratoria on commercial reprocessing of spent nuclear fuel and on the construction of commercial breeder reactors. We called for pursuing more actively than before the longstanding US policy of trying to discourage the accumulation of separated plutonium in civil nuclear fuel cycles elsewhere. And we called for actively working to prevent the deployment of uranium enrichment and spent fuel reprocessing capacity in additional countries. We had recommendations as well relating to advanced technologies in the renewable domain. We called for accelerating the development and the deployment of non-petroleum transportation fuel alternatives, especially cellulosic ethanol and diesel made from biomass and wastes. Big increase recommended in the research and development money for that, as well as $750 million in early deployment incentives between 2008 and 2017. We called for very substantially increased research, development, and demonstration on solar photovoltaic and solar thermal energy systems. And we called for expanding the renewable production tax credit through 2009, and at the same time expanding the eligibility to include all of the non-carbon energy sources, including hydropower, next-generation nuclear plants, and fossil fuel power plants with carbon capture and sequestration, because the point of this is reducing carbon emissions. We couldn't think of any good reason why all of the low and no carbon sources shouldn't be included. We called for increases in a variety of activities related to improving energy end-use efficiency, increasing manufacturer and consumer incentives for more efficient vehicles, increasing federal research and development and demonstration on improving the efficiency of buildings and appliances, increasing research and development on improved efficiency in industrial processes. Big opportunities for improving energy efficiency in all of those domains. There are a number of places you can go to read more detail about all of this. We had recommendations on oil and gas supply, energy supply infrastructure, regulation, which in the interest of time I have not summarized here. The whole report is on the web. The background papers are all on the web, including the economic analysis of the implications of the Commission's proposals were they to be implemented. And what I'm going to do now is turn to the panelists. And I'm going to start with a question to Phil Sharp, a multi-part question. What were the principles that helped this commission fashion a set of recommendations that it could actually agree on in spite of the political and sectoral diversity of its members? And how did those principles play out in developing the recommendation among all of these that I think most people will assume was the most contentious one, namely the recommendation about measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, exactly. The greenhouse gas emissions proposals are probably the most significant politically out of the report in terms of trying to address a major problem. While there are others that are quite relevant, and the package itself, I think, is significant, they are not exactly new to the debate in this country, and variations on those policies have generally been adopted in the past. But let me suggest 4 principles. At the beginning of our report, it identifies several more than this, but I think these were the keys. Having heard the litany of all the ways that things that we're recommending, the first principle may not strike you as having been as relevant as it really was. And that is that first and foremost, we accepted the power of the private marketplace and the importance of competitive markets in attracting the investment that's necessary to produce it, to distribute it efficiently, to get it to you and me as users of energy. That overwhelmingly, we are a market economy, and that's going to dominate and should dominate because of the efficiencies that can be gained from this process. Now with that, however, and the default position was that would be the Commission's position on any issue unless there was a reason that could be articulated for why the marketplace was not going to perform in a way that was critical to some national goal, and therefore we needed to intervene in the marketplace. And those of us that have been involved in intervention for 25 years in the marketplace, some of us have become more reluctant interveners, having found that it doesn't always work and you don't get the results that you like. But with that, clearly the Commission was not laissez-faire or pure laissez-faire by any stretch of the imagination. The two central reasons that we talked about intervention had to do with national security issues on the oil market and protection of the infrastructure here at home, and the other was in terms of the environment, in which it's universally agreed that the marketplace will not deliver environmental goods unless there usually is some kind of either government incentive or government restraint that then you can get the investor to focus on those issues. And those were the two overwhelming. There was a third, and that was that we did see areas in which the markets weren't performing very well, and partly because of government policy they're not performing well. We have quite a bit of what I would call policy chaos in the electricity sector, and it is a high-risk proposition for us in electricity because we have conflict between federal and state government. We have a lot of unsettled questions. We're not getting the kind of infrastructure investment that many people think is going to be necessary 3 and 5 years out, and we made some recommendations on how we ought to straighten that out so we can maximize what the private sector ought to be doing more effectively in terms of electricity. And then there were a couple instances where we were just worried that things like the natural gas pipeline out of Alaska was just simply too big a project for private capital to digest without high certainty as to what the prices of natural gas would be. And so that would be delayed another 25 or 30 years, one could never know, and we did come to the conclusion the government ought to intervene and help finance that. But let me suggest to you how the second principle was policy flexibility, that is recognizing that policy must be able to adjust to new information and new conditions. The third had to be politically viable in today's political world, not what we might dream or wish about were the politics in this country, but in today's world. And fourth, revenue neutrality, which is really today's political world, meaning that we couldn't expect to recommend a bunch of increases in federal spending on this, given the deficit and just the political need to find money for whatever you're doing at the national scene today. These came to play on the climate change issue in several ways. First of all, what we did do is while we adopted a cap and trade, that obviously in the lexicon of most policy people is different than command and control. It is trying to recognize the value of maximizing the flexibility once you set restraints on emissions, that the marketplace can have the chance to, and investors and business operators can have a chance to adjust and not have to meet a specific standard and go into specific technologies. We didn't try to dictate those, we tried to have flexibility. So in adopting that, we left a heavy emphasis on the marketplace. In terms of political flexibility, it also, or policy flexibility, because there is a lot that's unknown about which technologies are going to come into play, unknown about the direction the science is going to go on this, even though many of us believe the science is going to only intensify, the consensus is only going to intensify, that this is a serious problem that we have to address. We don't know all the directions that that's going to take, and we certainly don't know where the whole international political scene is going to be, which is very relevant to whether or not any set of actions is going to pay off or be highly costly. In terms of political viability, we trust very clearly that John already alluded to two of the powerful political arguments that have been used in the Congress against the U.S. taking action on this issue in terms of restraining any kind of mandatory program and restraining emissions. Now let me address the first argument, which is there are three essential arguments that keep getting used against it. One is we don't have the evidence is not there that this is really a problem that the humans have created or we need to focus on. Put inelegantly or inartfully by one prominent senator, it's a hoax. Well, our commission, while we did not denounce it was not a hoax, there was nobody who bought into this silliness. And we simply, while we did look at scientific information and had presentations, nobody from the right or the left on our commission bought the notion this is not something that we have to take very seriously whatever the uncertainties are about which direction science is going, we just dismiss that argument. It's just not an acceptable argument. So we don't have an answer to that except it's wrong. Now the second two arguments, though, we did try to address because there are serious political concerns. And one is, you don't know how much this is going to cost us, and this could be really expensive. And there's a big debate been raging over how costly Kyoto would have been for us, a big debate raging over various proposals, and one side claims that it's going to absolutely break the bank, kill, really damage our economy severely. The other side said, oh, you're full of it, it's hardly cost us a thing. And we frankly, honestly don't know. You can get all kinds of speculation. So what we did is we chose a path with what we call the safety valve, in which we said, we will assure the American people that this program, when it starts out in the whole first phase, we will know it'll never get above a certain figure. And that is the safety valve figure, where the government would sell credits, endlessly sell credits to anybody at the level that we set as the safety valve. Now, if you're intense on this issue and you believe you have to control emissions and that has to be the first and foremost thing, you're not going to like what we did, because we put the emphasis on the certainty of cost control because it's such a political hot button in the country today. And our belief is we have to get started, and this is a way to politically get started that makes sense. Second thing that we did to answer was, well, what if we go ahead and we take the lead on this, as we started to do, and the rest of the country the world doesn't come along, especially the Chinese and the Indians and the Brazilians and the Mexicans, and they're going to overwhelm us, everybody believes, with the emissions over the next 25, 30 years. So we will have damaged ourselves in international competition, we will have led the way, and in fact, it won't solve the problem. And there's some legitimacy to this argument, except the rest of the world says, you guys are the biggest polluters, why haven't you started? You don't even do anything, come off it. And so what we say is, we will get started, but we will not stop, but we stop making the reductions at a certain level after 5 years for a chance to reconsider. This has two effects. One's it reassures the political side of the fence in America that you're going to damage us, that nope, there's again a ceiling here. That's what the way the law works. To go farther, you're going to have to change the law. You're going to have to come back in and have a public policy reconsideration here. The other thing it does is it signals the rest of the world, we've taken this seriously, we're going seriously, but if you're not coming along, you can't count on us just to keep going. You have to play in this game as well. So we think this has value. And finally, revenue neutrality. I didn't mean to take so long here. We actually will earn the federal government some money, which might not be a bad thing in this climate of fiscal irresponsibility, which we never balanced the budget while I was there in 20 years, so I can hardly throw stones, but they managed to outdo us by unbelievable. We never, in 20 years, we weren't able to match what they've been able to do in 3 or 5. But the point really here is that because of the selling of the credits by the federal government, that will bring in enough revenue. There are different ways that people argue you might redistribute this revenue, but it certainly would pay for all that research and development that John is talking about and everything else, and it's one of the keys to our revenue neutrality.
Thank you, Phil. I want to turn to Sue Tierney and raise the following question. Other than climate policy, the most conspicuous of the various forms of paralysis in U.S. energy policy for the last decade and more has been the failure to tighten the CAFE standards. And I wonder if you would elaborate on the extent to which that was a difficult issue for the Commission and on the features of the recommendation on CAFE that made agreement possible.
Who would have thought it would be easier to construct an agreement on climate change than on CAFE? But indeed, this was an issue that we came back to early and often because it was a very difficult issue. The debates broke down on a number of bases. They broke down initially on the question of, how important is it to do something about this issue? How important is it that transportation uses 40% of our energy? How difficult of an issue is it to deal with the fact that that is the one sector of the economy where there's really not much fuel substitution and it's oil dependent and the economy goes through a shock when there are price issues. So we spent a lot of time debating what to do about this issue. We also spent a lot of time debating about what to do, what's the best way to go about it. Do you impose a fuel tax? There were debates about the best instrument of policy to deal with the question of continuously rising consumption of oil in the transportation sector. Do you do that through regulation? Do you do that through making consumers have fewer choices in the showrooms, a la cafe, which is how it was described in some senses? Or do you use it through a more pure economic instrument like a tax? I think it might actually be the case that many of the, maybe even a majority of the members, if they thought they could make it happen, would have thought that a tax would be a better instrument to do it. But nobody thought that that was a realistic scenario that we could get to. So the question that we backed into is you've got to do something about oil. You've got to do something about the transportation sector. Regulation is a tool that has been an appropriate mechanism here. Then the issue was, do you really address this through supply strategies versus demand strategies? And CAFE is really a demand reduction strategy for dealing with the oil problem. And there was a lot of debate about why don't you just go get more oil? Obviously, I'm exaggerating to simplify that point, but why don't we just provide that increment of oil through ANWR or through other mechanisms versus reducing the amount of consumption per mile traveled. But ultimately, at the end of the day, we, through back and forth on a number of issues, we got to the point where we needed to do something. This was a monumentally difficult problem. And then we had to deal with different sacred cow constituency issues. Is it a safety, are vehicles that are lighter weight, are they safe enough? Are vehicles that are driven by a CAFE policy, are they all going to be foreign produced? What are we going to do about that? We've got a jobs problem in the US if we don't address that issue. So we had a number of different kind of sacred cows that we had to address. And at the end of the day, again, I'll go through the litany. We had to do something. CAFE is a strategy that has been stalled forever. In the combination and constellations of issues that we were dealing with, there was a bargain that was struck that on top of the taxing type of mechanism, which is the way that a climate policy would be affecting the economy, there would be a implication for the economy as if it looked like a tax on carbon. We needed to go farther than that. People agreed on that. We then had to debate a number of the detailed issues. And the way that we were able at the end of the day to get a bargain on this was by addressing the fact that there are technical issues that we didn't feel competent or we couldn't bust each other's chops up enough to come to some kind of agreement on, and that we would ask Congress to instruct the National Transportation Safety Administration to figure out what would be the right number. We debated, as John mentioned a minute ago, what would be a range of plausible numbers. There were those on the commission who felt that a small ratchet up was enough, and those who felt that a major ratchet up was necessary. And we agreed on saying that we needed to move this ball significantly. Congress should instruct NIST to move the ball significantly. We would adopt a manufacturer's incentive for retooling for these hybrid cars as a way to deal with the domestic production and the labor types of issues. We also were looking for consumer incentives for buying hybrid cars as well. A package of policies, which is essentially at the end of the day, how we could bargain that something was going to happen in this area. So yeah, it was hard. It was at the very last end of the last thing that we had to negotiate.
Thank you. Bill Rosenberg, the work that you did as a consultant for the commission was mostly focused on how to accelerate a transition to advanced technology for electricity generation from coal. Would you talk a bit first about why it's important that that happen and about the key ideas in the approach that you recommended for getting it done?
Thank you. I must commend your leadership on the commission and the members for having produced a spectacular document, and that is, the breadth was clear when you were presenting what all the issues were. I think it'll serve the Congress and the public for a long time to come, and I am very pleased to have worked with it. I had a job when I was a member of the Ford administration as the assistant administrator for the Federal Energy Administration for energy resource development, and my job was to facilitate the use of coal. That was right after the Arab oil embargo. And I had some regulatory authority where I ordered certain plants to shift from gas to coal that used to be on coal because of our national policy.
I didn't realize that was you, Bill.
Yeah. And then I got another job about 11 years later in the Bush administration, the first Bush, where my job was to clean the air. And I found myself signing an order on the same plant, directing them to go from coal to gas, which proves the point that in Washington, where you stand depends on where you sit. What I have been trying to do here as a researcher is to reconcile these two issues of strategic environmental concerns relating to coal as a major source of conventional air pollution, as well as carbon dioxide emissions. 36% of the carbon dioxide emissions in the United States come from coal plants, which are primarily used for making power. And the fact that we use 51% of our power comes from coal. We have resources that are very large. We have as much hydrocarbons in coal as the Saudis have hydrocarbons in oil. And if you look at coal as a source of hydrocarbons in a very difficult package, and it's kind of useful. We don't take oil and put it in a car. We take it out of the ground, and it's got lots of stuff in it. It's got a lot of sulfur, and it's got a lot of trace metals, and it's got things we wouldn't want to burn and put into the atmosphere. We take it and put it into a refinery. And in that refinery, we withdraw many of the impurities, we gasify the hydrocarbons, and we put it back together in the form of cocktails, gasoline, diesel fuel, jet fuel, chemicals to make plastics, even asphalt. And that's what a refinery does. But what we do with coal, we are still reliant on Dr. Watt's invention in 1769 of the steam engine. We grind up the coal and put it into a boiler that makes steam, and we then use the steam to generate power. Now, we're a little more sophisticated, but basically, a power plant is a very advanced steam engine. What gasification of coal is essentially putting the coal in a refinery, taking out the impurities before you combust it, and then ending up with a very clean source of gas that works in modern appliances, large ones, pretty much the way natural gas works. You end up, after you take the coal and put it in a gasifier, and you put it under pressure and heat, and you add water, steam, and you add oxygen, you end up with carbon monoxide, CO, and hydrogen, which burns in a, for example, a natural gas power plant, just like a natural gas burns. So the first point of the fact is that we have resources, we have these hydrocarbons, we have the technology that's been developed in the last 15 or 20 years. In fact, part of the Clean Air Act was to provide the Department of Energy with $5 billion for the Clean Coal Technology Program that Congressman Sharp was instrumental with Senator Byrd of West Virginia in causing. So we have the technology to refine this coal. What we need is the capital. And so we have developed here a plan on providing that capital in complicated solutions in such a ways to make the power using clean coal technology no more expensive than producing new electricity from power plants using conventional technology. And we're trying to work with the Congress to do that. In the process of doing that, another factor came forward, and this is very interesting to me, and that is, in the last 3 or 4 years, the price of natural gas, for all of you who have natural gas to heat your house, you know this very well, the price of natural gas has more than doubled. It has gone at the wholesale level from about $2.50 per million BTU, which is the measurement of the energy content in natural gas, to over $7, which means in 2004, the cost of the gas that America was using to fuel its homes and its universities to heat this building and its factories increased by the cost of $75 billion a year for the same amount of gas. And the principal reason that happened was that we built about $150 billion worth of natural gas power plants that had a gigantic appetite for natural gas, on the assumption that there would be more natural gas produced as the price rose. Well, what happened was there was no substantial new gas that came into the marketplace. This additional demand for natural gas bid the price up for everybody else, and the poor people not the poor people, the rich people that invested in these power plants became less rich, because these power plants went belly up in many cases. But the problem was that accelerated the cost of gas. So one of the advantages of gasifying coal is to provide a substitute fuel for the natural gas demand in these power plants that would enable the demand of natural gas in the United States to go down, and therefore the prices of natural gas to go down for home heating, for industrial use, and for commercial heating as well. And so we're working on how to develop a financial system that produces the equivalent of clean synthetic gas from coal, equivalent to what we hope to get from the Alaskan gas pipeline when that opens to deliver Alaskan natural gas.
Thanks, Bill. I had a wonderful second round of questions. We're running a little behind. I think I'm going to do an extraordinary thing. I'm going to direct a simpler version of the second question to each of you and ask you to answer it in a minute. And then because we want to have plenty of time for Q&A with the audience. Phil, given your background in the Congress and energy issues there, I have to ask you what you think about the energy bill that's now shaping up in Congress. How similar is it to our recommendations on the Commission? Is it going to pass? And if it fails, is it possible that something that's more like our recommendations would then rise from the ashes?
Well, first of all, yes, it will pass. There will be a bill sometime in this century. I think this one, will pass this. A bill on energy policy will pass this time. It'll be pared down. I have no idea fully what it's going to be, but then I warn you, I've made this prediction in each of the last 3 Congresses and been wrong. I also lost my first 2 elections. It takes me a while to get it right, so don't take the prediction. Secondly, there are aspects, and we could go through them if we had time, in which it does reflect things that are in the bill. We talked about the Alaskan natural gas pipeline. Actually, they passed that last year. We got our recommendation out to try to encourage that to happen. But the 2 places where they will not, it seems improbable, even though there will be debate in the Senate, that they will take any strong action, is nothing mandatory in terms of emissions control like we are talking about on climate change. And I frankly think this will be is a mistake on their part, and only delays getting at this. Again, remember, our approach from the Commission, mine personally as well, is we don't need to start out doing big things. We simply must start. We must begin to send a signal to the marketplace, as well as, by the way, it's a signal to the government. What people don't understand is when all the interests are pushing and pulling about what the research and development budget ought to be, that politics will change when industry knows that it has to meet restraints on carbon, because they will be in there saying, you got to be focused this money on things that will pay off in terms of a low carbon economy. So this is valuable both from what public policy will be and that. I think they will not get there, though the most interesting thing is, despite the increase in Republican control and the assumption that they oppose climate change. It's not an accurate assumption. The fact is they're going to have much more intense efforts to advance some things on climate in the U.S. Senate particularly than they had in the last Congress. The other place where I think where they will not very unlikely take action is on strengthening the CAFE standards, though here again the interesting thing was the Bush administration split from the Reagan administration. Under President Reagan, this was ideologically simply not acceptable to have the government mess with the CAFE, those are the fuel economy standards. The Bush administration just increased them through administratively as they can, as you alluded to, on trucks. But that's minor compared to what we think needs to be done. And by the way, that is necessary to help make sure the hybrid seriously comes into the marketplace. This hybrid is not a sure bet thing. The technology may be, it's still more expensive, it's primarily being driven, and the cross-subsidization in the companies is being driven by the fact that California is requiring certain things on the environmental side that make it imperative that the companies advance this. And by the way, if the American companies don't move, the American-based, well, they're now all American-based companies, I mean, Toyota and Honda are going to eat the lunch of the formerly big three if they don't get off the dime on this kind of thing. So the bill, excuse me, I couldn't resist getting that in. I used to represent a lot of auto
gone
production.
over a minute.
I've gone over a minute. My apologies. So they're not going to do this. So there'll be some useful things be done. They'll miss the boat on that. But essentially, it will not fundamentally change our oil dependency and not fundamentally address the climate change. And therefore, we'll have to go back to the drawing board again and again over the next several years.
Thank you. Sue, the Energy Foundation, whose board you chair, is heavily focused on efficiency and renewables. Do you think the Commission went far enough in its recommendations on efficiency and renewables? Where might you have wished it went farther, aside maybe from a tougher CAFE recommendation?
Oh, you took the words out of my mouth. I would have been happier to see a tougher CAFE ratchet. But I think of the package that we came up with as not quite as much as I would have liked to see, but I was surprised at how far we could get. In a world in which just about everybody from the Commission came from representing some thing that they liked on energy, you know, more supply, one form of R&D or another, I really felt that the package we came up with was an efficiency and renewable strategy. Does that mean we ask for light bulbs? No. Does that mean, though, that the energy use of our economy that will result from the package of programs that we have will be much more efficient? Yes. It will be much more efficient as a result of our climate package, much more efficient as a result of the CAFE type of strategy in the transportation sector. In the building sector, we have a number of initiatives to reap energy efficiency savings out of construction techniques, light bulbs, and other appliance standards that puts much more efficient appliances and equipment into the marketplace. So on those levels, I think it was very good. On renewables, one of the elements we haven't really talked about very much was a package of strategies to increase the use of biofuels in the transportation sector as a way to displace oil use for some percentage of liquid fuel use in motor vehicles. This is a renewable resource strategy. It's really important. Additionally, we had some other strategies with regard to infrastructure siting and interconnection standards for renewable resources, things that make it very difficult for things like wind power projects to get on board these days. So I would have loved to see more things, but in the scheme of things, it was a pretty cool package from my point of view.
Good, thank you. Bill, the coal technology recommendations that you were very helpful with have been getting a particularly large amount of attention. It's quite clear that combining those coal technology recommendations with the carbon cap and trade scheme was responsible for the remarkable endorsement of the United Mine Workers of the package. United Mine Workers issued a press release the same day the report came out saying that they endorsed the Commission's recommendations on limiting carbon dioxide emissions because they were paired with an advanced technology recommendation that provided a way for the coal industry to continue to function as an important part of the economy.
And in case people miss it, this is a huge political move. This is a big, radical shift when anybody out of the coal industry or the coal miners moves over and says you should restrain carbon, this shows you that the politics is changing.
And at the same time, as remarkable as that is, not everybody in the environmental community is supporting those recommendations. There are a lot of different players, different industries with different stakes in this issue. You've been talking to all of them. Are we going to find common ground on this issue? Is this going to be able to move forward?
That's hard to predict, but there's another big movement politically that I see that might result in some action in this bill, and that is there have been hundreds of thousands of jobs lost because of the price of natural gas. That we have industries like the fertilizer industry, the chemical industry, the plastics industry, the glass industry, pulp and paper. These are all industries that use a tremendous amount of gas that had their basic economics founded on the $2 to $3 costs that were historic prices. They are moving production abroad. In other words, they're closing down plants. There was a 7,000 worker layoff in West Virginia from the old Union Carbide plant that closed down, and Dow Chemical moved that production to Europe, and the major oil companies and the major chemical companies have announced tens of billions of dollars of investment in the Middle East for production of chemicals as well as liquefied natural gas. The industries that are hurting are now speaking to the Congress. In fact, they endorsed this national gasification strategy. The CEO of Dow and DuPont and Eastman Chemical and Georgia Pacific and International Paper, Corning, have all endorsed a provision to provide incentives for them to build coal gasification plants to create clean synthesis gas to substitute for natural gas. So I think that there's a decent chance in this bill that we will see incentives for both the utilities and for industries to deploy this technology. And of course, we're taking the position as well that there should be an equal amount of money for incentives to do demonstration projects on these deployments of gasification to test and begin to demonstrate how CO2 can be captured and put into the ground and stored there in old oil and gas wells and other geological formations. So I think the economic issues associated with industry may result in your recommendations being significantly implemented in a reasonably short time.
Good. John, could I just add one thing? I just urge you folks to take a look at what we said about nuclear power, because this is an issue that is under reconsideration now in our public debate. And I'm just guessing in this audience there are a number of people who have ideologically always opposed it. I could be misreading the audience. But the precise reason for reconsideration has to do with its carbon-free content. There's no those emissions. There are other problems, obviously, with nuclear power. But because of the difficulty in meeting our energy needs in a carbon-constrained world, this is getting significant reconsideration, and our commission is one indication of that. We didn't come out just wildly for nuclear power, but we clearly took a step toward it in a way that most people thought we would duck it. And that's what most of these reports do, is they just duck the issue because it's politically third-rail issue.
And Phil,
Like
the same point with the environmental community. The environmental community 4 years ago would not touch coal at all. They were off coal. But now you're hearing them saying, okay, we know there's going to be coal, and what we need to make sure that there's a joint initiative for advanced coal technology and work on sequestration of CO2 in the same recognition that China's building a new coal plant every week. And if we don't deal with that, we're not going to deal with the carbon problem.
John, they got an extra shot.
They did, Sue. I see I'm doomed. Go ahead.
One of the things you're hearing is that the commission decided at the beginning of the 3-year process that everybody's favorite silver bullets would stay at the side of the room, and that there were no sacred cows. We would talk about everything, again, except Anwar, and see what were the reasons, the principles for either approaching or staying away from a particular technology or fuel. As a result, what you see is the kind of balanced, all sorts of things need to be part of the mix. That is one of the things that causes the stalemate in energy policy forever. Because everybody's bringing their particular thing and fighting with each other to death to save that one. And we felt we needed to have some kind of balanced approach. Okay, sorry, John.
Thank you. I want to open it up now to Q&A. We have 2 microphones on the 2 sides of the room. Most of you know the rules. Line up behind the microphone. We'll alternate between them. You should identify your affiliation. The microphones are open for questions. A question is at most 2 sentences, the second of which ends with a question mark. And you can either direct it to a particular member of the panel or I'll choose. Start over here.
Hi, Ron Luher, MPP2 here at Kennedy School.
Maybe step a little closer to the mic.
Sure. This question is for Commissioner Tierney or anyone else. What do you think of, on the question of reducing emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 emissions from cars, what do you think of social marketing initiatives such as the Footprint Neutral program, which tries to reach out to,
Which program?
The Footprint Neutral program. It's a UNDP program which tries to reach out to consumers and give them the option of offsetting the emissions from their cars, lifetime emissions, by, basically they could finance some sort of energy efficiency project or some sort of sequestration or forestation project somewhere else in the world. It's not a silver bullet, but what do you think of that?
The more the merrier. There are a lot of people who want to have the kind of choices that you're describing in a number of ways, including the one that you're describing, are trying to give people choices in a world in which we don't have a policy that constrains carbon and allows these kind of trades to go. So it's a great idea.
Okay, maybe.
No follow-up. Too many people. Over here, please.
Hello, my name is Nadat Taib, and I'm from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts. First, I want to say thank you for coming. And my question is directed to Mr. Sharp with regards to your earlier comment about the Brazilian and the Mexicans, the Indians and the Chinese overwhelming the US with their emissions. My question is, how do you respond to the allegation from the developing countries that they deserve their ecological space to develop, that it's the developed countries that are responsible for the vast bulk of historical emissions, they're the ones responsible for the problem and should be the ones hurting the most and paying the most to cut emissions first, and furthermore that emissions should be on a per capita basis?
I totally agree with you. What I said we were trying to answer is the critics who disagree with that, who seem to be prominent in the US Senate, who have a narrow American view that we only do right. I'm overstating that, obviously. The reality is we have had a golden day, we have had a wonderful ride economically, and we have put a lot of the emissions, we put a quarter of the emissions up in the atmosphere, and we have to take the lead, and we cannot pretend that it's somebody else. But it's also true that over the next 50 years, our emissions will be a much smaller percent, assuming the economic growth we're assuming in the rest of the world. So what we need to be sure is happening in China, India, and elsewhere is that they are adopting the most efficient technologies, that they are adopting these. One of the things we're trying to get our people to understand here is we have stakes in the research and development of those kind of technologies because our long-term interests are with you or with the rest of the world in terms of making that happen there. We clearly have to lead. I think it's a pathetic excuse on the part of Americans that we don't.
Thank you. It's very inspiring to hear someone say that.
On this side.
Matthew Eisman, I'm a PhD candidate in the physics department. It seems very important that the $7 per metric ton safety valve price that you set not be too high or too low. I was just curious how the commission decided on that price level.
It was absolute genius. Absolute genius.
We'll let
and
Phil
nobody
take that
knows it was just a political compromise.
I think I can be a little bit.
Here's a numbers cruncher.
I'll be a little bit candid about this one. There were basically 2 factions on the commission.
One for 10 and one for 5.
There was a faction that most of the original argument was had in terms of dollars per ton of contained carbon, as the international argument is also denominated. And there was a faction that wanted $10 to $15 per ton of contained carbon, and there was a faction that wanted 30 to 50. And guess what? The number that was agreed on, $26 a ton of contained carbon, is pretty much in the middle of that range. So you can more or less figure out how that emerged. A pure compromise. On my left.
My name is Dylan Voorhees. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. I recognize that this was a national commission on energy policy, but I wonder if you can reflect on the role for states. We all know that California, just as its size, is influential, but a lot of times when there is a stalemate on national policy, the states have a role. Can
Absolutely. I mean, the states drove policy in the 70s. They're driving it again today, and more power to them. Now, one of the things you have to recognize is some of the things that states are doing are not smart for national economic efficiency purposes. But politically, what they will finally do is wake up the U.S. Congress so that it will say it is wiser to have a national regulatory standard on fans or air conditioners than it is to have 50 states. And that's essentially what's happening. It's happening in this energy bill today. That's the way we got those standards originally. Same thing with pollution control on cars. That's the way it happened. And that's the way it's happening again on climate change. I mean, it frankly isn't smart for states to individually have massive interventions for climate change, and none of them are having massive. They are, and of course California is pushing very hard on the automobile, but I think, one, the laboratory actually does. We learn something, and as the laboratory of our states, we argue that's a good cause. But secondly, it also brings political pressure. Sue and I I share with her on the board of the Energy Foundation, and very frankly, our political strategy and the way we're allocating funds is for the state movements to push efficiency in the states, because we're not very confident that that has gotten on the national agenda.
So you've been a state energy official. Do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, the commission went out of its way to point out a number of ways in which the states have been leading on these issues, whether it's efficiency in buildings or pollution control in a number of stationary sources, et cetera. So we recognize that, and it was because Washington isn't doing something that's why we pointed our attention there.
Back to my right.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Dell, and I'm an undergraduate here. My question, I guess, is for Ms. Tierney.
I'm a miss. Thank you very much.
I'm very interested in transportation policy.
Yeah.
And the recommendations that you discussed seemed exclusively geared toward reducing carbon emission within the framework of private automobiles. And was there any discussion or consideration of large-scale subsidies of public transportation in an effort to reduce the carbon emission and carbon consumption of the transportation sector?
That is a great question, and I would say that there are probably two areas that we could have spent more time and attention on. One of them is the one that you're describing. We did spend a lot of research money as well as discussion time looking at things like bus, rail, rapid transit systems, which are an economically efficient way to get a lot of people moving in urban areas that are already built up. And it's a great technique, especially in developing countries. It's great. The other thing that we didn't work on, because frankly it's so amorphous, is sprawl type of issues, which are really important when you think about energy consumption and the car world that we live in. So that would have been great if we had done it, and I'm glad you're working on it.
And back to this side.
Hi, my name is Josh Potashnik. I'm a sophomore at Harvard College. And my question is about ANWR, which has obviously been getting a lot of attention lately. But the aggravating thing was that it seems like ANWR had always been being debated in a vacuum, that everybody is just looking at ANWR and not looking at these other issues that you're discussing. My question is, was there any effort in the Congress, maybe within the last 2 or 3 years, to reach a compromise and say, okay, we'll do ANWR as long as you increase CAFE standards or increase funding for R&D or any of these other great things that we'd like to see? Was there any effort to make a deal where you incorporate ANWR into that larger energy framework?
Actually, that has been sort of attempted about 3 or 4 times in the last 20 years. Senator Johnston of Louisiana was always a prominent advocate of this, and he was never able to pull it off. And we frankly, in 1992, which was the last comprehensive energy bill, and I was very much involved in that one, we didn't attempt it. And I personally think that should have been an absolute condition of the opening up of ANWR, was in return that you do something dramatic on the efficiency side as well. There's some other constraints you ought to have on ANWR as well, but that's...
Good. Ian?
Yes, hi. Ian Springsteel. I'm a student here, an MPA student here at the Kennedy School. About 18 states have passed laws over the past 7 to 10 years promoting renewable energy called renewable portfolio standards that requires utilities to deliver a certain percentage of energy to customers from renewables. I was hoping you could give me your reflections on the appetite in the current Congress and the current energy bill debate for a national renewable portfolio standard.
Sue?
This is one of those things that people love or hate. I'm a fan of renewable portfolio standards. I would have been happy had the commission, for example, done this. That's not what you asked about. You asked about it in Congress. I don't think it's likely to move forward these days. Maybe you have a different opinion on that, Phil.
I have a slightly different...
Okay, so go.
Only because I was pleasantly surprised. I was in Washington on a panel with folks from the U.S. Senate about the energy bill today, and I was very surprised to hear that there's actually an intense negotiation going on between Senator Domenici, the Republican, and Senator Bingaman, and the Democrats are trying to make this a part in the Senate of the thing, and actually some people believe there's a real chance. Now the catch is what they want to put in as under renewable center thing would include new nuclear power and some other things. So whether you can negotiate these kinds of things or not, but I was stunned in the last 2 weeks to learn that there was an increasing probability that some sort of national renewable portfolio standard might get into this legislation. I wouldn't hold my breath. I've assumed that it just was too much of a market intervention for many of the folks in the current Congress.
Good. Yes?
Sorry. Hi, I'm Josh Busby, a fellow in the International Security Program here at the Belfer Center. And my question is, are you any more optimistic today than you were in December when the report was launched? Because in terms of some of your recommendations being taken up, I've noticed in the press there's more coverage of the sort of geo-green fusion of neoconservatives, whether it be Jim Woolsey, who is on the commission, but also Frank Gaffney, and you see coverage by Fareed Zakaria, Andrew Sullivan, and a number of bloggers kind of playing this up, whether it be Tom Friedman in the New York Times. And I'm wondering if that's leading to any shift in Capitol Hill in terms of seriousness on, particularly with respect to petroleum.
I'm going to give that one to you again, Phil.
Well,
our Capitol Hill
I think
expert.
the answer is both yes and no. I don't think there's any question. The geo-green thing is focused overwhelmingly on the oil security question. But there you have to take action on CAFE if you're serious. Even some of the people in that geo-green coalition, when they spoke as to what they supported, it doesn't begin to move us forward. Now, several people in that coalition, like Jim Woolsey, believe very strongly in CAFE, but the others don't. If you don't go with that or some big tax on gasoline or something, you're not going to budge this issue. These are big markets. You have to intervene strongly to have an impact.
And biofuels, too, is
and
the other
biofuels,
area.
and advance that. But even that it seems to be at some distance in terms of time that we really think we can pay off. On the green side, however, I think that is reviving very significantly. And indeed now, in the evangelical movement, the stewardship of the earth is becoming a much more prominent issue, as it should be. And the movement on climate, I think, is moving far more rapidly than the national political leadership, and they're beginning to respond to it.
Good. Yes.
Jørgen Henningsen. I'm on a one-year fellowship here at Harvard from the European Commission, where I have been a bureaucrat on environment policy and energy policy for the better part of 20 years. Now, before asking an unfair question to the panel, I'd like to make the comment that in my view...
But it can only be one sentence.
You'll get your unfair question. But I would like to say that in a European perspective, this is the most encouraging document that has come out of the US, I think, in this field for decades.
Thank you.
So I think that should be just mentioned here.
That's a setup for a tough question.
My unfair question is the following, that if the Commission had been discussing the CAFE standard question today and not a year ago, with the medium-term outlook for oil prices in the range of $55 a barrel instead of the $30 a barrel that was the Energy Information Administration's number a year ago, do you believe that that would have had any impact on the character of the recommendation? And if not, why not?
I'll try to start the answer. I wish it would have. Wouldn't you think that those level of oil prices would be getting a lot more movement? But I don't think it would, because we debated on principles. Of course we did economic analyses, but the debate on the principles of the impact on jobs, the impact on safety, the impact on can we get enough testosterone going in performance of automobiles, those were the basis for the debate. So as a result, I don't know that I think it would have been that different. You may have a different point of view.
We're only going to take one more question because it's just about 20 after and we need to adjourn, but we will take one more here.
How do you do? Thank you for coming. My name is Pat Stanley. I'm a mid-career at the Kennedy School, and I'm from Alaska. And so I couldn't stay seated with the gentleman's question. And my question for you is, I know that it's in the budget, but what are the possibilities of not having it happen?
Well,
Phil,
interestingly enough, it may be that the budget is in more trouble than anything else in the Congress, because they actually have a fiscal crisis, believe it or not, and they're having enormous difficulties. So whether they can ever get what they have to get is a very special piece of legislation called reconciliation together, but that won't come until August or so, and that's where this will occur if it does. The House will pass it again like they did in the energy bill, but the key is in the Senate. Those who favor the opening of ANWR believe they're going to win this time for the first time ever. But they still haven't, until they have it in hand, you don't know.
Thank you. Let me just, in 30 seconds of closing remarks, say that I think all of us, if pushed, would say the recommendations of this commission are not absolutely the best energy policy we could imagine. If any of us had been king or queen and allowed to write our own energy policy, it would have differed in some ways from what we came up with. But we do think it is about the best energy policy package that a group this diverse, politically and sectorally, could come up with under the current circumstances. And we think it's good enough that it serves as sort of an existence proof that people of diverse backgrounds, politically and sectorally, can come up with something that has the principal ingredients an energy policy needs to have at this moment in time. And we're hoping that it might embarrass the United States Congress and administration into producing something a little better than what they have produced so far. Thank you all very much for coming. I thank the panel.